How's that? Great. My name is Michael Duffy. I'm the facilitator. We'll be talking to Sandi Logan, as you can see from up there. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, on whose land we're meeting, the land that was taken from them, and welcome you to this session. Sandi Logan was a journalist for a long time, and then he went to government communications, a long and lively career. You can tell us more about yourself if you want to, Sandi, but he's written this book called Betrayed, about one of the most extraordinary crimes that I've come across in a long time. It's an intriguing read. In fact, it deserves to be made into a movie, and possibly it will be. But anyway, can you join me, please, in welcoming Sandi? It starts with two American women, and I'd like Sandi to start by telling us anything more you'd like to about yourself before we get going. The key point here, though, is that Sandi became engaged in this story very early on. So do you mind just telling us who were these people before they got into their criminal adventure?
They were two, what I would describe as sliced white bread American women. They didn't lead extraordinary lives. They were both retired at the time that their nephew, for want of another term, groomed them into the idea of driving a campervan from Stuttgart to Bombay, as we all do. They had never traveled overseas before. They were what I would describe as unworldly. I might even suggest they were naive. But for one of the two, who will go by the name of Toddie, her full name was Vera Todd Hayes, and so her nickname she was known by was Toddie. Toddie had very close bonds with her two sisters and two brothers and all of their offspring. And it was one of those offspring, a nephew, Vern, who did the grooming and set them up on the trip. Beezie, whose full name was Florice Marie Bessire. Beezie was a longtime friend of Toddie's. They had worked together on the assembly line of McDonnell Douglas in Los Angeles. And they had retired more or less together up to La Pine, a small logging and outdoorsy community in Oregon, Central Oregon.
And they were in a relationship, weren't they?
Well, they were longtime companions, Michael. I never asked them the basis of their relationship. I didn't ask them the basis of their friendship, and I do address that in the book. But frankly, it was irrelevant to me what the basis of their companionship was, except to say, I'm so glad that at least they were together in jail. They could not have done this without each other's support.
Yep, definitely. Now, I should say that we're going to have to skim over this story. The detail is just so intriguing. You'll still need to buy the book afterwards if you're interested in it, but we are going to tell the story, having said that. So it all starts June 1977. Good year, good time. There's a knock on the door, and this fellow, Vern Todd, the nephew, arrives. And he's the third character in this drama, and he and his relationship with the women is absolutely extraordinary. So to start off with, who was Vern at that point?
Vern was by then a nephew of Toddie's who'd lived in Australia for more than 10 years. He was a yachty out of Santa Monica. He loved sailing. He'd participated and crewed on a number of races to Hawaii and then finally to Australia. He, in fact, crewed on the Nam Sang in the Sydney to Hobart on a couple of occasions. And he so enjoyed Australia that he decided to settle here. And for all the family knew of Vern, he'd become a successful businessman, was an actor, was a model, was by 77 married and had a couple of children, a couple of boys. And nothing he could do was wrong in anyone's eyes, but they didn't know any different. He was a successful businessman. He told them he was involved in import-exports. So when he knocks on the door and says to Toddie and Beezie, have I got an idea for you? I'm getting a camper van fitted out and I'd love you to drive it. You've never been abroad before. Would you like to drive the camper van? Because they had a camper van of their own. Toddie jumped at it. Beezie was a little hesitant. Toddie jumped at it. And they thought on it for a few weeks and then decided No, let's do it. This sounds like a great opportunity to actually live the National Geographic magazines, of which they were ardent subscribers.
And of course, the big question hanging over the book is how much did they know, and when. So we need to say, don't we, for the purpose of full disclosure, that he did offer them some money to do this.
Oh, indeed. And he said, the $25,000 I'll pay you when you get to Bombay. You will earn every penny of it. The roads you'll be driving are dreadful. They're goat tracks in many places. The food you'll be eating, you'll have no idea what it is that you are consuming. The languages you'll encounter will really challenge you. He said, you'll earn that money, and I have no hesitation in offering you $25,000. He was also paying their expenses. So he was flying them over and providing them with the van to drive and stocking it with food and water, etc. But for them, it was more the adventure. As I say, this was a couple who'd never traveled abroad before. The only time they'd left the United States had been out of LA, not uncommon, to go into Mexico to buy some leather sandals. And that was the only international travel they'd ever done. So this was beyond their wildest dreams. And the idea of a $25,000 paycheck at the end of it. And Vern did mention, but they took no note of it. Oh, there might be a little grass on board because, Auntie Vera, I smoke a little marijuana. They thought nothing of it. They said if that's Vern's gig, they were both cigarette smokers, and they loved to drink, but that wasn't their interest, and they didn't give it a second thought. As you will find when you read the book, that was to come back and haunt them in a big way.
25 grand, by the way, is about 122,000 US these days, so it was a hefty amount of money. Okay, so they accept the offer, a bit of weed, $120,000 to drive the van. They must have had a bit of courage, must they? Because, as you say, they'd never left America before, except a brief trip to Mexico. It was quite a courageous thing for some retired women to do.
They were real outdoors people, though. They loved fishing and hunting and hiking and campervanning. And Toddie had been a women's Army Corps, I think, sergeant or corporal. And Beezie had worked on the Manhattan Project. And Toddie was also a champion softballer and almost made the U.S. Olympic team in '36 to go to the Berlin Games. So they were both strong women. Toddie was almost six foot, maybe 5'10". Beezie was a little shorter than that. But they didn't resile from a challenge. They were great company in a local bar in La Pine, sussing out the customers, having a conversation, and if there was a little trouble that they detected, they would just let the publican know, the bartender know, who was a friend of theirs they'd befriended, and just to be on the lookout. So they weren't worldly, but they weren't stupid. They were smart people to the extent that they had life skills underneath their belt.
So they get to Germany, and this is a story of a con, basically, I think. Well, that's one reading of it anyway. And there's a document that emerges. I think it's called a carnet. Is that right? Right pronunciation?
Correct.
That was almost central to the various lies and stories that were told to lure them throughout the rest of this trip. Can you tell us what a carnet is?
So a carnet, which is a French term, is essentially for a customs document that you attach to any asset of significant value that you're taking into a country while you're traveling, and leaving the country with. So it might be, say, a TV crew going in to shoot, and your cameras, your lights, your sound recording gear, or it could be the Paris to Dakar car rally, and each of those vehicles has a carnet attached to it. It ensures that any asset you enter a country with, you must leave with. If you don't, then it's considered that you've obviously sold it, and if you sold it, you owe that country its due taxes, its share of the proceeds. So this carnet over the campervan, to ensure the 9 countries they went into and out of had the campervan attached to Toddie's passport, was something Vern arranged on their arrival in Stuttgart. Now, they didn't know anything about a carnet, and I would suspect and suggest few here know much about a carnet either. So they were fooled by that. They didn't think twice about it. And Toddie flew with Vern over to London, signed the carnet there, because I believe the van had last been registered there. But I also think Vern, the nephew, was using London as a bit of a put the narcs off the scent, because a lot of vehicles were coming out of Germany at this stage, stuffed full of hashish into Australia and being exported to other parts of the world.
So then they get this massive, I think it was a Mercedes, wasn't it? Mobile home.
Yep. Mercedes-Benz campervan, about 8 meters, 26 feet long, diesel, manual.
Fantastic. And so they start driving it on, I guess, what used to be called the hippie trail almost, didn't it? I mean, it's kind of nostalgic almost. They're able to drive across the Middle East, not entirely without incident, but they could go through what are now war zones.
Initially, they drove through Germany and Austria, and they thought, whoa, this is terrific, wunderbar on the Autobahn. Not realizing, of course, that as they traveled further east, they'd be hitting what was then Yugoslavia and Bulgaria and Turkey. I mean, they went into Tehran on the cusp of the revolution. They had no idea. All they thought was it was very busy and very noisy and very dirty. And then on to Peshawar, where the van it disappears for a couple of days, when Vern arrives on the scene and says, "I've got some new camera gear. I've got to take the van to go and practice some shooting." The van's gone for a couple of days. And if you know Peshawar and you know the hippie trail, it's probably some of the finest cannabis grown in the world. So I'm told, in Peshawar.
Yeah, I mean, Vern's a really interesting presence in all this, because he keeps popping up with what to me are increasingly implausible, excuses and stories, doesn't he, to lure them on? And then when they get to a border, he suddenly, where's Vern?
When I spoke to the women in jail over the 3.5 years that I spent on what I thought was going to be an 8-paragraph police round story, I got the feeling that Beezie all along smelt a rat, and right from the outset, she wasn't keen on this, but she went along with it, and with every kind of false step that Toddie would make, or that Vern would make, his unreliability, his not keeping dates that he'd said he would show up. He had a company, and some of you might remember a product in the 70s called the Tubby Bath. And the Tubby Bath was an inflatable, like a small swimming pool that you would blow up, put on the kitchen table, fill with warm water, and bathe the baby in. And then you could deflate it and put it away. You didn't need to have a big bath or a fixed baby bath, as it were. And Vern said, "Look, I'll be coming along, and we'll be doing shopping center promotions in Tehran of Tubby Bath." So you see what I'm saying? Like, he was entirely implausible, but the women didn't know any different. They accept. But Beezie thought, I just got this sense that Beezie thought more as each one of these failings occurred, that there's just something not right. But, and I'll conclude, but what Beezie wasn't prepared to do was to call Vern out on it and say, "Toddie, we're not going any further." Toddie made so much of the importance of family, and that her nephew Vern, her brother Vern Sr.'s son, would not do anything to hurt you or me. How dare you say that about Vern? So Beezie was between a rock and a really hard place on that one.
Yeah, and I noticed, I was trying to work out in my own mind where was the point of no return in terms of knowledge, and they're approaching the Indian border, aren't they? And I think I've written it down here. Yeah, Vern is in the camper van with them, and they're approaching the border, and suddenly he leaves and says, "I'll meet you on the other side in case there's any trouble." Well, that's not looking good. And at this point, was it Toddie says, "Vern, I think there's something going on. Both Beezie and I feel it, And Vern replies, "Well, frankly, Vera, it's none of your goddamn business." And that's
and that's such a great point to make, Michael, because this is then when it turns from the carnet is in your name, you can't just leave the van and go, to intimidation and threats of violence. It's much bigger than you or me. to the point where they're in Bombay, now Mumbai, and there are three drug kingpins managing this particular shipment: Vern, the nephew, Mr. X, and Philip Shine.
But they'd been told Bombay was the end of the trip, hadn't they?
Bombay was to be the end of the trip.
Sorry, did go on, but
yes.
I thought we should emphasise that. They think, oh, well, we're here anyway. It's all
We've
over.
done it.
Thank goodness.
And Toddie's health is not good, and she's had enough. She's had a gutful. And suddenly Philip Shine, who is more present on the trip than Vern, he suddenly appears in Vern's stead and says, "I'm sorry, but Vern couldn't make it. You have to go on to Australia. The carnet is still in your name. If you leave the van here and fly home to the United States, the authorities will be chasing you and you'll be looking over your shoulders for the rest of your lives. You don't want to get into trouble." And there was a conversation, and I describe it and refer to it in the book, that Beezie did not get to listen to between Philip Shine and Toddie. And I was telling a few people the other day that after 40 years of finally writing the book, and I've got to say thank you very much to Hachette for publishing it, but I could not find and track down Philip Shine. I could track down Vern Todd, and you'll find out what happens to him in the book. And I did find Mr. X, and you'll find out about him, but I couldn't find Philip Shine until 3 weeks ago. And he's alive, he's not well, living in northern New South Wales. And
Has he been in touch?
I've tried to get back in touch with him. I was in touch with him when he was in jail in Germany to try and get him to give me a statement absolving the women. Of course, he wasn't going to have a bar of that. But I'd love to know what Philip's and Vern's now passed, but what Philip's side of the story is. But I don't know that my timing's very good because he's not well at all. So Philip threatens them and threatens Toddie, and Toddie basically says to Beezie, "We're going to have to go to Australia." And I believe in terms of where it really all goes to mud is the minute they set foot on Australian soil. They're done. They're done. It doesn't matter whether they step sideways, forwards, backwards. They're done. And the extent to which the organizers go to try and exhaust the resources of the then Federal Bureau of Narcotics, who did a phenomenal job without Excel, without a computer, with customs brokers' manifests, page by A3 page by A3 page, looking for certain shipments on vessels coming out of Bombay. They picked this bus up and thought this might be the mother lode. And from Toddie and Beezie's point of perspective, there was nothing they could do other than, I think, dig the hole deeper or be mired further into the quicksand.
Yeah, but that is the interesting thing about Vern in a way, isn't it? That his appalling treatment of his aunt, that it was partly a con, but also partly a bully, a threat, wasn't it? Basically, he just sucked them in so far that they were scared, basically.
Absolutely, and in the end, they essentially did whatever they were told to do because Toddie had got on a number of occasions very close to what was going on and a very good sniff of what was happening, and no pun intended, because they didn't know what hashish smelt like. You would think, 2 tons in your van, what's that smell? But they didn't know what hashish smelt like, so they weren't to know that was what the smell of the van was, especially after all the countries they traveled through and the foods and what have you. But from Vern's perspective, I would almost describe it as sociopathic. He cared not a jot about his aunt or Beezie, and it may well have been, there's some suggestion of this, that there were people above Vern who were saying, "Vern, there's over $1 million of hard cold cash in this job, and if 20 grand was 120, $1 million was probably 5 or 6 in today's dollars. That's a lot of money to be just throwing, and the potential return was 12 to 19 million. So Vern, there's some suggestion that that Vern was prepared to was prepared to let not just let the women go to jail. He was prepared to let them die if needs be.
Wow. Okay, so they get to Australia, and we should. You sort of indicated this before, but the Australian Narcotic Bureau, or whatever, were actually aware that this was a method that was being used for major importation of drugs. So that's one of the reasons why they got onto it. They started to get suspicious.
Correct. And the modus operandi that Vern and his organization used was to specialize on three types of vehicles: Renault R4, Mercedes-Benz short wheelbase delivery type van, or the campervan. And they had done at least one other campervan that got through, and this campervan that came through that the Narcotics Bureau intelligence analysts picked up, they targeted, and they went on board the ship and before it was unloaded, and did a drill test. And they put 6 different drill bits in, and each one of them struck gold. And on the estimation of the floor length of the vehicle and the depth that the drill bit showed, the black resin, the cannabis resin on the bit, they thought it was probably 60 to 80 kilos. This is big, they thought. Well, 2 tons is a bit more than 60 to 80 kilos.
Yeah, I should say, so they reached Australia in December 1977, and it's about 6 months after Donald Mackay was disappeared down in Griffith. So marijuana was a big deal back then. It was a huge story, and state police were pretty corrupt, but the Federal Narcotics Bureau in general was not corrupt, and they were the ones that got onto this. But the next bit of the story is, for me, one of the most fascinating, that they get to Australia. So once again, you think, well, something's going to happen now. But they just drive this van around for a while. What happened there?
Well, Vern, as always is the case, in big crime, the Mr. Biggs or the Mrs. Biggs or the Ms. Biggs, they don't want to get their hands dirty on the stuff. They've got underlings doing all of that for them. But Vern had taken a particular interest in this shipment by, actually being present overseas on several occasions. And he was doing the same thing in Australia. He was getting fairly close to the actual operation, which was unusual. But that was because his aunt was on board, and because it was such a big, valuable load. But Vern also figured that this was happening over Christmas and New Year, when traditionally we're all on holiday, we're down the beach. And Vern was hoping he could simply outlast the Bureau. They'd run out of budget. They could not keep following him with 15 or 20 agents, 6 or 7 vehicles and a motorcycle for 6, 7, 8 weeks. Well, yes, they could. And they did. They were determined to get Vern. They were not Shorty, but to get Vern. They were determined that this was the one, and it was going to be a big one. And they had plenty on him, and they knew that it was Vern and Philip Shine. And of course, they had the two Grannies, but the 2 Grannies weren't, whom the media called, by the way, drug grannies. Neither the women are grannies, neither the women did drugs, but that was the moniker that stuck. But they were determined that they were going to get Vern Todd on this job.
And I just want to digress for a fascinating detail, not entirely relevant to the plot of this particular story, but these these auctions in Woollahra, I think you described. Can you just tell us how that used to work?
Well, Vern, and he wasn't the only one who staged them, but Vern first started moving cannabis out of Griffith into Sydney, and he had good connections there. And they would bring essentially a van loaded with cannabis and park it, and they would then run an auction at a party in his John Street house. And you would have to, he would say that the van, it's a Bedford van, a tear of 1.2 tons, fully loaded, and they would auction the van off. And whoever was prepared to take the chance and pay the money for an uncertain load would then get the keys to the van and drive it off and hope that they were going to make a killing out of it. Now since then, and I want to come back to your reference to Donald Mackay and cannabis in Australia at the time, because I think we need to also get a context, some more context around the times, which will also explain then why the Grannies got the jail sentence they got and were treated the way they were. But I just want to mention one thing, and a reader, and a number of readers have contacted me with amazing information, none of which I knew. And one of them was from a woman whose father was a senior police officer in the eastern suburbs, knew that there were corrupt coppers in the area, and he was doing undercover work, taking photos of Vern and his minions moving cannabis out of an old dairy 2 streets down from John Street that was now disused, in, she claimed, ice cream vans, like Mr. Whippy ice cream vans. Now, when I heard that, was told that, I went and asked a couple of narcotics agents still alive from this job, have you ever heard of that? And unfortunately, they're both Melbourne-based, and they said they hadn't, but they said they wouldn't put it past Vern, that, an ice cream van would be a great way to move your stuff around. The context, cannabis was I think relatively popular in the 70s. I first arrived in Australia in the late 60s, and I was certainly aware that there was cannabis in the air. And in the 70s, it became quite profitable. But I think at the time, not only was the then government suggesting that you just had to say no, that's all you have to do, and then you won't take drugs. You just say no. But also, heroin was beginning to rear its ugly, ugly head. And there was a lot of smack coming into the country in the mid to late 70s. And our heroin usage and consumption per capita was worse than New York City in the late 70s. So I think there was a real concern among legislators about the heroin epidemic we were about to, or were now experiencing. And for them, it was easy just to throw all drugs in one batch: cannabis, hashish, smack, cocaine, as little as there was of it, LSD, and speed. And so all drugs were bad, and we're not going to have a debate today about whether cannabis has got any medicinal benefits, or in fact whether it is as dangerous as heroin, which I think we all know it's not. But anyway.
Okay, so tell us about the arrest.
They were arrested.
Why at that particular point, though? Because you've talked about how the Bureau could have followed them forever, as it were.
I think they were finally pulled in because the Narcotics Bureau realized their operation had been compromised, and that Vern was likely gone, had done the Herald hold. There are suggestions that there was some political interference. I don't detail it because it was not strong enough. It was simply anecdotal information that my Narcotics Bureau sources told me. But that ultimately the operation was compromised, and I do detail that. And one of the very important surveillance positions they had on Vern's house in John Street was moved at the insistence of a very, 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 very senior person. And I think the Bureau felt, we're gonna wear this terribly if we don't get someone for this. We've been following the van. We've got tracking device on it. We know who's involved. We just need to act. The other thing I think that forced their hand was one of the two grannies decided. Well, they both decided together, because one was in hospital by this stage. They both decided that one of them should fly home, get the house ready for when she was released from hospital, get the gutters cleared, get the heating going, because by now it was January in La Pine. It would have been quite cold. And they'd only been expected to be gone a couple of months at the most. Not now, they're up to 4 months that they were gone. They'd left their poodle with neighbors. And what was going to happen to Suzette? Who was going to explain to Suzette that they'd been away so long? So I think that's why the Bureau acted, that their hand was kind of forced. One of the grannies was at the airport.
And it's a bit of a classic police dilemma, isn't it? It's easier to get the people down the bottom. You wait for a while on the hope of getting some of the higher ups, but more often than not, you can't. So you just got to grab what you can get.
And Michael, to this day, Michelle Curry, Mish Curry, who writes the foreword to the book, and has been just wonderful in helping me get the right sequence of events there for the book. Mish to this day feels terrible about the fact the women were thrown into jail. She has never forgiven Vern for what he did to the two women, and she's quite sincere about that. I used to visit them in jail every week for 3.5 years, and if I didn't get there on the weekend because I had another commitment on, then I would go midweek. And the jail authorities were fantastic. They were very tolerant because they were good prisoners. So it was in their interest that if they missed out on a visit on the weekend, we'll arrange one midweek. But Mish, the narc who went undercover and busted them, used to go in and visit them under a pseudonym. That's how bad she felt about it.
And once they were arrested and interviewed, did they? What did they tell the police? And in particular, did they roll on Vern? Did they?
They told them everything. They had no idea just how, A, get a lawyer before you say anything. B, it doesn't matter how good it sounds to you telling the coppers. The coppers are just doing their job, and they're just going to take down all your admissions and then use them as evidence in a court of law. They had no idea of this.
And this is the biggest drug importation in Australian history to that point, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So,
but you see, they had no idea. They had no. And Bob Drain, the other narc that worked with Michelle on this job, Bob said in a Four Corners story that I was at the time working at the ABC on Four Corners, and I produced an episode with Peter Ross. And Bob, whom we interviewed, says on tape, on camera, I don't think the Grannies had any idea how big the load was. They did get an idea eventually while they were in Australia that the van was not carrying gummy bears. It was carrying hashish, or it was carrying drugs, and there was a lot in it. But he's quite certain that they had no idea. Toddie uses some really colorful language that Mish told me about when they showed Toddie one of the packets that they extracted from the van, from the floor of the van, the entire water tank, the water tank for the vehicle, and a few other spots that had been fashioned for smuggling. And I won't use the language that Toddie used, but when they put the packet down in front of Toddie, they said, "You know what this is?" And Toddie says, "No, I wouldn't have any idea." And they said, "Well, that's a pound of hashish." Well, I never seen that before. And there are another 4,236 of these inside your van. To which she said, "No wonder that mother campervan wouldn't go up those hills." And she was talking about the Australian experience. And Mish told me, she said, "I'll never forget some of those hills," because she said, "I was riding pillion on the back of a motorcycle undercover." And she said, "I burned the soles of my boots through sitting on the exhaust pipe because we were going so slow to keep back of the camper van while they were surveilling, while they were following."
It's amazing. So they do all that. Despite all that, Vern has never been charged or even caught for this, has he?
So Vern escapes the country. And these were the days before chips in passports, iris scans at boarding gates or departure gates. The high-tech fingerprint was about as good as it got. But Vern had a suitcase full of passports and identities, and he had a lot of cash, a lot of like cash, as well as money in overseas banks. And he either sailed out of Sydney, where he had a yacht that he was having built in Hong Kong, which ended up in LA, on which Michael Caton, the Australian actor, and Vern would sail regularly. And Michael talks about this openly. I'm not divulging anything in secret here. Michael's quite open about it.
And he wasn't involved at all, of course.
No. Well, Michael does actually talk about, it's not in the book, so I can tell you this. Michael was an official taste tester for Vern, because Vern didn't do cannabis very well. He got a bit paranoid. And
are you sure about this? Is this on the record?
Oh yeah,
right.
It's on air. It's on the History Listen. So it's a 2-part podcast I did for the ABC on the History Listen. So if you just Google Drug Grannies ABC, you'll find the two. But read the book first. Read the book first.
But would Michael Caton deny it, do you think?
No, it's his voice.
Okay, fair enough.
It's his voice, and I have a witness.
That's good enough for me. So anyway, they get 14 years without parole, which is just bizarre.
But I think we need to say they pleaded guilty.
Yeah.
They pled guilty. And I still don't know to this day why. I mean, I wasn't there, of course. I wasn't sitting in. They were represented by Australian Legal Aid. And I can only think the reason why they pleaded guilty was because their legal advice was, you signed the vehicle in. You can't say you didn't import the vehicle. You imported the vehicle. I've got the bloody import form here, and it's got Vera Todd Hayes signed on it. So you can't plead not guilty to importing a campervan. That it also contained 2 tons of hash is besides the point. You brought the van in. I think the advice was also, and if you plead guilty, it may be viewed better by the judge, and you'll save the taxpayer money. And being foreigners, you'll get a sentence, but you'll probably only do a bit of time, and then you'll be deported. That's normally what happened. And as Michael said, they got 14 years jail with no non-parole, nothing on the bottom. 14 years. I mean, I don't know what you can do. Are there any good crime fiction writers here? Tell me, what can you do to get 14 years? And you know, it's got to be pretty serious crime.
It's still a bit of a mystery because in the same year, I think a boat called the Anoa brought an even bigger quantity of Buddha sticks into Australia, and Murray Riley, one of our most famous organised crims, and his mates all got 10 years for that, and they were out after 5. So that
Murray was an Olympic athlete.
Well, but you know, if you think of that as a standard thing, 14 years was a big hit. So how did you get involved in this?
Well, it goes all the way back to a stint I was doing back in my hometown, Toronto, on the Toronto Sun. And I'd started out as a reporter here as a cadet here in Australia. And I traveled overseas, you know, on the strength of being able to write an 8-paragraph police round story or a 10-paragraph feature. And one night on the late shift on the Toronto Sun police desk, I saw the wires clacking away. And my job, among others, was on the late shift, and any journalists here know that, you know, if the Pope gets shot or the president goes down or man walks on the moon or woman walks on the moon, you know, hold page 1, and you got to keep abreast of what's breaking. And in those days, it came on a telex roll. And one night on the telex roll, as I was checking it, you know, before I knocked off, I saw a story that came out of Australia. 2 elderly, 59 and 61, that's middle-aged, 2 elderly American tourists sentenced to 14 years jail for importing 2 tons of hash. A, I'd lived in Australia, so I was, you know, sensitized to that. B, I thought, you know, 150 grams would have been enough. 2 tons is a bit excessive. 3, it's a big value load. And 4, they're 2 American women who on the face of it have no family. So I ripped it off, kept it. And a year later, when I returned to Australia, I started to chase it down. And by now we're into 79, and I'm working as a journal. At that time, I was on a magazine subbing, and I then went on to the ABC with City Extra, and I got permission, finally, writing to the women over several letters saying, can I come and chat with you? I'm a journalist, da, 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 da. They finally agreed to see me, but it was on the basis of no story. We just want to talk to you. And I realized then, Michael, I didn't realize that it would take control for the next 3.5 years and then be locked away in the shed for 40 years. But I realized when I went to visit them that these were human beings who had been dealt a terrible injustice. All the other stuff aside, 14 years in jail with no family, no support, on their own in Malawa initially, and that's a tough jail in those days. That was a tough jail. Now, when I met them, they were in a low security, minimum security, almost a prison farm at Tomago. It was beautiful. They didn't even lock the front gate there. That was how trusted the prisoners were. But of course, I could come and go when I wanted. They couldn't. And I thought, I need to do more. I was idealistic. I was young. I was, you know, I thought as a journal, yeah, I can contact a few people and make this happen. Well, it didn't work that way. There was much more at play around the women's incarceration. There were political messages. There were challenges around working closely with the Americans in drug interdiction, and the Americans then saying, "Oh, but not these American women. You got to let them go." Like that didn't work. The Americans were really hesitant about imposing themselves into the situation too much. There were just so many irons in the fire that complicated it and did not make it an easy case to fight for. But I just felt these women needed someone. They needed someone to fight for them, and I didn't think the fight that was on at the time, a possible appeal, a possible early release, I didn't think that was going to work. Well, little did I know it was going to take another 3.5 years.
You mentioned an appeal, which is interesting. Why? I don't think they ever appealed their sentence, did they? Why
so
was that?
They did appeal, and then they withdrew. Yeah. And they withdrew because the advice they got from their barrister was, the risk you face on a 14-year sentence is a non-parole period of 6, 7, maybe 8 years. And the advice was, I think it's better for you as Americans to try and wait this out for a couple years and be deported. Be released on license, they call it, as a Commonwealth prisoner, and deported back home. So rather than risk a minimum sentence, it was actually seen, a minimum sentence now, before parole was considered, was actually seen as a worse outcome than the original 14 years and no non-parole.
So, I mean, obviously, I don't think either of them had any criminal record, did they, before this? No. How did they fare in prison? I mean, mixing with some pretty dangerous people at Mullewa, which is at Silverwater Women's Jail.
They survived a riot. They saved 2 officers' lives. There was an ambush set up with window pane picks, like knives, to attack the guards when they came in. The heroin that was getting into the jail at the time was horrendous. They were seen as essentially as snitches or as goodies, because they simply wanted to do their time, get this over and done with. But they were also good mentors, good exemplars for other women prisoners. They also rediscovered their Christian faith. That wasn't something with which I was involved or associated, but they had a great network of Christian folk who supported them and regularly visited and prayed with them. And then they had their lawyer, their legal aid solicitor, and their lawyer. So they didn't have a lot, but for them it was just toe the line, do what you're told, and we're all going to get through this eventually. Having said that, some of the entries in the diaries which they gave to me are just heartbreaking. You feel you're like a page away from turning to one of them being dead, probably Toddie. Toddie was so close to ending it all on several occasions, and you can understand. I could understand why her health just deteriorated terribly, and she became an addict of Serapax, sleeping pills, Valium, Mogadon. She was like a pharmacy chest.
We've already established that Vern got away with it. What about his co-criminal Philip Shine? I think Toddie helped was it the West German police there?
Both of them did. Both of them gave evidence on 4 separate occasions. The West Germans, the then West Germans, came to Australia and convened a court hearing in the jail, and the women gave evidence against Philip Shine, who had been extradited from Paris, where he'd been found. He was at that time living with a dancer named Jacqueline, and Jacqueline was introduced, which was what tipped off the German police on the job. She was introduced each night for her set at the nightclub as La Belle Jacqueline Shine, and that gave the cops the hint that this must be Philip's girl, and sure enough, he would drop her off and he would pick her up. And so they nabbed Philip on information they got from another country altogether. That was, however, one of the target export markets of this group. Brought him back to Frankfurt and tried him and Mrs. X for their role in drug distribution. And Shine was convicted on the strength of the women's evidence. He made no statement. He did not take, he was not cross-examined because he had nothing to say, which of course is why he wasn't going to give me a statement on tape that I'd asked him to, absolving the women, because as far as his position was, he had nothing at all to say. He was convicted on the women's evidence, given a 10-year sentence, which was the maximum, and got a 7-year non-parole period, and did about 6.5 of that. And just as an indication of what Philip Shine was like, who did the crime and did the time, when he was let out of jail, the first call he made was back to Harold Kerner, the prosecutor, at his office by arrangement, to thank him for a fair trial and to let him know he was returning to Australia to return to his first love, which was antiques, apparently. And he headed off and returned to Australia, and took a couple of years to reestablish himself, and then became quite entrenched in activities, quite legal activities in Australia.
Wow. I should say for our friends watching us on Zoom that we'll stop in a couple of minutes, and if you've got any questions, please send them through now. You can do that, and we'd be keen to answer them. So the interesting thing here is that it was the Federal Attorney General who had the power to release our friends. That's quite unusual, but at the same time, we're approaching the 1983 election. That was when Bob Hawke was elected, of course. So we're in the what turned out to be the dying days of the Fraser government, who probably didn't want to look soft on crime, did they?
Precisely. So, and it was a Commonwealth offence, and that's why they were Commonwealth prisoners. And anyone at that time, under the tough new legislation that had been increased, that it had the prison period of imprisonment increased to 25 years, anyone importing drugs at that stage was charged under Commonwealth law, and they were federal, that was federal legislation, but they were, of course, detained. They were incarcerated in a state penitentiary, a state jail, but they were Commonwealth prisoners. And that was, again, one of the contradictions for the women. While they were in jail, there was a guy named Rex Buckets Jackson here in New South Wales, and you could present Rex with a bucket of money, and you'd get early release. And the women couldn't work this out. Why are all these people well, A, they weren't Commonwealth prisoners. B, we didn't know at the time just how corrupt Rex was. But that was to come out in the end, and he was convicted and did jail time himself. And so for the women, they were reliant on the Commonwealth Attorney General, Senator Peter Durack, for his mercy. And on numerous occasions, which I detail in the book, and this is where Toddie is so close to topping herself on so many occasions, because she's this close to being released, and then for some, you'll find out what the reasons are, but they keep getting knocked back, and their hopes are raised. And if there's one thing I learned as a young kid journalist is make sure of your facts before you go into a jail and tell the prisoners, I've been told you're going to be released. Because when you're wrong, it's just devastating. And I did that only the one time, but it was frankly once too many. It was just devastating for them.
Looking back on your activity then, how do you feel that you are combining your job as an ABC journalist with being an activist, in effect?
I feel guilty, Your Honor. And I think in those days, though, Michael, there was a greater tolerance, not so much to activist journalism, but that because I had an in with the Grannies and I was so close to them, I was able to, set up a Four Corners episode, get the crew into the jail, film interviews with them, recreate the run. We actually tracked down the campervan that had been auctioned off by admin services after the drug bust. The same thing for City Extra. When they were knocked back, I was producing Caroline Jones, City Extra, and went out and interviewed them, and we put that to air, and then we interviewed their. So there was a certain I guess, benefit that the executive producers saw, or my bosses saw at various times in having me in this role. But I think, you know, it's probably not something that would be and should not be tolerated, would not be tolerated now, I don't think.
So thank you. The Shadow Attorney General, we'll stop in a second, Gareth Evans, is asked if he supports the drug grannies in the lead up to the election, and not being stupid, he says, of course not. However, once he's elected, what happens?
Within 10 days of being sworn in, he does the right thing, and he releases them, and they get word in the morning, and by that night, that evening, they're on a Qantas plane home. And again, the detail is all there in the book. It was just such a happy, in a sense, relief. It wasn't a jubilation. It was just relief that it's finally over. And my wife and I joined the women a couple of days later, and spent a couple of weeks with them, settling them back into their home in La Pine. And it was at that point that Toddie and Beezie said, you know, we don't want any more of this. Like, they were quite traumatized, you could imagine. Here, take our diaries, take the audio cassettes, take our correspondence, take our photos. You one day, you write the story, you tell it. And so it took a few days, that one day, and finally, here's Betrayed.
Well, thanks, Sandy. We're glad you did write it anyway. Any questions, please?
Sandy, it seems like there was, after a long period in which organised crime in Australia kind of resiled from drug trafficking, with the onset of the Windsor Castle set and Mr. Asia in the mid-70s, and old school crooks like Stan the Man starting to import drugs. What was the nephew's relationship to that established Sydney milieu? And also, did he have any connection to Nugan Hand, given their involvement in drug trafficking as well?
I didn't find any connection to Nugan Hand with Vern. In terms of his connections with others in Sydney, he was well connected, and I do outline it in the book with whom he was connected in some of the deals that he did. The thing about Vern was and again, this is on the record from Michael Caton in the interview I did with him. Michael says Vern was a born capitalist. He understood demand and supply. He was a businessman who knew there was a market out there, and he was going to, meet the market's needs. And he was very good at it. And there are many people who speak quite warmly of the service that Vern provided at the time. I have no evidence that Vern moved anything other than cannabis and cannabis resin. There's nothing that I've ever seen that would suggest he was into any powders or any pills.
Yeah, thanks very much for a really entertaining session. It's fantastic. He was a born capitalist. What else did he do? I mean, this is an incredible thing. And to pick on your aunt, was this the first of many, or was it a one-off of this scale? What was it?
His legitimate business interests included the tubby bath. It included conversions of dune buggies. It included scrubbing clean old ceiling fans to go into tropical homes. I mean, this was a guy who in his teens in LA used to collect pine cones and turn them into handles for drawers. He was a guy that saw opportunities. And he also was an actor. He did a couple of Grundy episodes. In fact, I tell the story in Betrayed of one time he was arrested for a very small quantity of hash. And it was a possession charge, not a distribution charge. The police asked the two women police officers in the raiding group asked him to sign his publicity shot for them to take away. So he did have legitimate business and other commercial enterprises going, but there has been some suggestion that he realized as a yachty coming down to Australia, you could move in and out relatively freely from this great island continent, and that might be something to consider for future business possibilities. And that's certainly what happened. Whether it came about as a result of his initial crewing, I don't know for a fact.
Thanks, Sandy. What happened to the women when they returned home? Did they remain close companions? Did the family blow up? You know,
No.
what became of them?
I won't give it all away, Kerry, except to say the Toddie's family, the Todds, it basically disintegrated. The two siblings, one of whom was the father of Vern, Toddie couldn't bear to face him. This, given this is what your son has done to me. Like, she felt bad for her brother. This is the sort of person she was. The other brother, Grover, he said to her, "Well, it was your fault. You should have been wise to it." So that didn't augur for a close relationship. The two sisters were the rock for Toddie. They supported her, right through and through. Beezie's sister and brother, to a lesser extent, stood by her all the way, and they remained in Lapine for a while. But Lapine had changed dramatically in the 5 years that they were gone, and they were now known around Lapine as the drug grannies, and that's not what they wanted. They wanted to be known as Toddie and Beezie.
And they're now deceased, aren't they?
They are.
Yeah. Another little detail there, not central but fascinating, was that I think one of them ended up moving down near the Mexican border, so in order, sort of driven by the high cost of American healthcare, so she could duck across to get her medications because it was cheaper on the other side of the border.
Yeah.
Extraordinary little detail.
Mm. Yeah.
Can I just ask you one last detail before we wrap up? The homecoming, when they physically actually went back to Lapine, what did they see there? There's just a really lovely detail, if you remember what I'm thinking about, involving the trees.
Yep.
Yep.
Well, they were on an 1.5-acre block in among the pine trees of Lapine, and it was a mobile home that they had bought and situated on the block, and it was still forest around them. And on one of the trees, their neighbors had tied up this lovely big yellow ribbon. It's actually, you can actually see, there's a 60 Minutes story that was done at the time of their return, and I think it's included. I'm pretty sure that there's vision of that blew us all away, because that was the one thing that Toddie always used to say, is, when I get home, I want a yellow, ribbon tied around that pine tree. And they did. What of course they didn't know was not only how the town had changed, but they also didn't know, but I guess suspected, that Suzette, their poodle, had passed long before. But those were all the sorts of, little things that tug at you and tugged at them that made them want to be home, and then they had to face the reality.
Oh, it's a great story, and we're very happy that you told it at last. Thanks very much. Can you join me, please, in thanking Sandy? And he'll be signing copies of his book outside.